To hear this and many more audiobooks not available on YouTube in a podcast feed, please visit the first link in the description below, and thank you for your support. America Against America by Wang Huning. Chapter 2. The Ancient Political Spirit. Part 1. American Spirit. H.S. Commager was a leading American historian and critic. The shelves of American university libraries are generally stocked with his works. He is regarded as a master of American studies. His book, The Growth of the United States of America, is well established in Chinese scholarship. The Spirit of America, his book released in 1950, was so well received by the community that it was reprinted more than 20 times. I read the Chinese version, translated by Nan Mu and others. I brought it with me from Shanghai to the United States, a long way. It is indeed an essential book for understanding the American spirit. H.S. Commager writes with sophistication and power, observes issues deeply, and is good at summarizing. He said he was not going to write a history book, but an interpretation, rather than a record. He strives to discover the elusive American spirit, a uniquely American way of thinking, acting, and characterizing. He chose the period from the mid-1880s to the 1940s as a watershed moment in American history and thought. The American Spirit is a large, thick book of 500,000 words, with a lively, in-depth, and distinctive discussion, and a marvelous mix of historical information and surprising analysis. What does Commager consider to be the American spirit? The primary premise is that Americans have their own character and their own philosophy. The American character is the product of the interaction of inheritance and environment. The origins of American culture and institutions can be traced back to ancient Greece, Rome, and Palestine, such as the church and the family system, as well as to values. But Commager sees this inheritance as a highly selective inheritance, where environment acts on selection, and where the political system and judicial system have changed very little in 200 years. But the social organization has changed radically, and the psychological aspects have been revolutionized. The American environment dissolves the differences between the different kinds of people who come here from different cultural backgrounds. It is not the local environment, but the whole environment of the United States that determines the American character or creates the American style of people, says Commager. The whole environment refers to the vast land mass, the ease of mobility, the atmosphere of independence, and the spirit of optimism and enterprise. In Europe, with its long tradition of feudalism and nationalism, the local transcended the total, while in the United States, having matured during the Industrial Revolution and not recognizing the strong local tradition that had to be broken, the total transcended the local. Commager raises a question worth pondering: the extraordinary complexity of the American racial origin, the differences in climates and soil conditions everywhere, and yet the tendency to develop a distinct and stable national character, which not only makes it difficult for critics to anticipate, but also unexplainable by history and experience as a whole. Everyone who wants to understand America is, above all, prepared to think about this question. What are the main characteristics of the American people's spirit according to Commager? I have excerpted some of them, probably as follows. The spirit of optimism is unusually unusual. Everything is going well in this country, and natural conditions are so favorable that every enterprising and lucky person can become rich. Optimism comes from the reality of change, where every day the wilderness turns into good land, villages into cities, and ideals into reality. The belief is that there is nothing that can't be done and that we will not rest until we have won. Americans care more about the future than they do about the past and today. They have no sense of history and believe that only old crone who are not interested in the future are interested in the families of the past. So they see the future presidents and millionaires in every barefoot boy, care for and love children, work for them, and let them grow. Broad vision, imagination galloping across the continent, hate trivial matters, indecisive and timid, hope for big scenes, easy to accept large-scale plans and grand undertakings. The culture is materialistic. It takes comfort for granted, and views those with a lesser standard of living with a sense of superiority. Always tenacious to overcome obstacles, partly because they are sure that perseverance combined with hard work, intelligence, and luck will always lead to good results. Their credo is hard work, with laziness as a sin. Anything conducive to increasing wealth is taken for granted. There is a strong concept of quantity and a tendency to evaluate almost everything in quantitative terms, such as demographics, skyscrapers, railroad miles, production records, etc. To depict Americans requires new vocabulary and even new mathematics. Practical, especially in politics, religion, culture, and science, but often romantic in business. Americans are always trying to invent new tools or technologies to adapt to new situations. They like to innovate and are less tradition-oriented and are willing to give anything a try. Their response to various things is very practical. There are thousands of inventions in the United States, and Americans are known for their enthusiasm for making small inventions. American colleges and universities were the first to offer technology courses. Americans hate theories and abstract thinking, avoiding esoteric political and behavioral philosophies like healthy people who don't take medicine, and they are not interested in any kind of philosophy beyond common sense. They instinctively think that only the unfortunate and the confused resort to that kind of esoteric philosophy. But they are not that kind of people. Religion, though of Calvinistic origin, is practical. They are religious but not pious. They no longer believe in the dogma that God saves mankind, but are instinctively convinced that salvation is only through work. Denominations were numerous, but were considered different organizations rather than different doctrines, and they could no longer tell the difference between Methodists and Presbyterians, just as they could not see the difference in principle between Republicans and Democrats. In politics, there is a strong aversion to empty theories and rhetoric. Some people laugh at the lack of political philosophy in the United States, and they take it in stride, believing that it is good not to be bound by political theories. No political party's rhetoric will be supported by them. Although Americans are young and unsophisticated, they are politically mature. Their political institutions are as flexible and effective as the machines they have invented. They were both skeptical and tolerant of culture when it interfered with more important activities, and tolerant when it became a pastime or an entertainment for women. In exceptional cases, they demand that culture be something useful. Americans care about education and spend money on it, and they want it to produce people of practical use. There is a nightmarish belief that they despise other nations and peoples almost to the point of paranoia. They believe that their country is superior and that they are superior to others, and this sense of superiority produces a natural sense of mission and a belief that they are the highest hope of the world. They love to experiment. The United States itself is one of the largest experimental fields. Since every group is a gamble, a chance, then the Americans are gamblers and opportunists. They rarely stay in one place, full of care about moving. They do not like the same old thing, always love to do what others have not done, willing to accept the challenge. It is democratic and completely equal. The environment opens the way for talent and luck. But their democracy is a social democracy, not an economic one. The concept of equality permeates the sphere of American life and thought. Their behavior, work, recreation, language, and literature, religion, and politics all reflect the concept of equality, and real life is governed by it. In fact, economic inequality is conceived as equality. Equality leads to cordial and sincere relations between people. Good-natured, generous, hospitable, love to make friends. The vast majority of people like to socialize and enjoy group life. They are casual, unpretentious, speak casually, dress casually, eat casually, and treat people casually, which may be considered indulgent and rude and uncouth. Find authority and rules and regulations to be a headache, and find it insulting and challenging to follow certain rules. There is little to no discipline in school. Parents rarely control their children, and children rarely respect their parents, but family life is happy. The military is lax in discipline but can fight wars. Americans have no apparent respect for the law but actually respect the rule of law, and the Constitution is the supreme law. And so on and so forth. Commager concludes that these beliefs cannot help but have practical consequences, and to be reflected in the everyday behavior of the American people. The chapter in which Commager summarizes these characteristics is called The 19th Century American. In fact, some of these generalizations are still relevant today. Naturally, one can give examples for and against any abstract generalization of real life. There are many examples that can be cited to refute Commager. However, as an American scholar's view of our nation, let's listen to it. All of what he says is good, which is a bit self-aggrandizing. In fact, the American nation has a number of shortcomings. Today, these spirits can be found in such practical aspects of life as the space shuttle and global war programs, the endless stream of new equipment, the abundance of statistical reports, the spirit of practicality, the noisy scene in the classroom, and the attitude toward government scandals. Sometimes it can be said that there is no spirit in social life, but when you discover it, it will be there. Or rather, there is spirit in the world, but the question is whether it is found or not. Hegel was convinced that he had discovered the absolute spirit. The spirit of the American people is that there is no absolute spirit. Part 2. The Mayflower. Massachusetts can be described as a political historical monument state. American monuments, you might say, are not many years old, but they are really crucial to the social and political development of the United States, to say the least. Europeans often ridicule the United States for its lack of history, but in fact, here reveals a question that is very worth exploring. The modern American society is only 200 years old. How it has developed into the first-class power in the world. This is an important phenomenon in human society today. Some people in China also say that the United States has no history. Most of the historical displays of the founding of the United States are concentrated in 2 states, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and in the area near Boston, Massachusetts. While in Philadelphia, I visited the historical sites in question, including the meeting place of several important meetings during the War of Independence, the place where the Constitution was drafted, and the Liberty Bell. There were also hordes of Americans and foreigners who came to see the sites. These places are well preserved and serve as physical textbooks of political traditions. In terms of physical textbooks, Americans excel at this. It is often suspected that there is little political education in American society, but the spirit of tradition is deeply rooted in the people. Here, physical textbooks played a lot of roles. Such places as the libraries of the Presidents of the United States established after retiring from office can be regarded as physical textbooks. The first chapters of the physical textbook are in Massachusetts. The Mayflower ship sent the first settlers to the American continent in 1620. This was the beginning of modern America. The Mayflower is a larger wooden schooner, and the current display is a replica but is said to resemble the original. Everything on board is still the same, and there are some people dressed in the costumes of the time who greet the passengers and talk seriously to the visitors about their hardships at sea and speak in the language of the time. They worked very carefully and meticulously. Not far from the Mayflower ship there is a huge stone which is said to be the place where the people on the Mayflower first set foot in America. The beginning of America. Americans generally trace the American spirit back to the Mayflower and believe that the basic principles of American society were established when the Mayflower sailed for the mainland. The 60 or so men on board established the foundation of society. This interpretation may be valid, but it cannot be overstated. One thing is certain, most of the people who came to America from Europe at that time were religiously persecuted or politically excluded, and it was in 1620, at the height of the Stuart dictatorship in England, that the English bourgeois revolution broke out 20 years later. It is clear who was willing to leave Europe and England at that time and what kind of state of mind they had when they came to this inhospitable land in order to escape from tyranny and persecution and to find freedom and wealth. This spirit inspired them to come to the New World. They arrived in a vast land without a complete political order, so they could fulfill their desires. If they had arrived in a place where a complete political system had already been established, these dozens of people would have had to accept reality, no matter how they turned their thoughts into actions. As many immigrants from all over the world are coming to the United States today, no one can change the system here. The spirit brought by the Mayflower grew and developed precisely because the land was also politically barren. However, it is important to note that the spirit could only be shared among the people on the Mayflower or among those who were like them, that is, among the white people. For a long time, the whites excluded the Indians and the blacks from the ranks of the people. An important reason for the subsequent establishment of the American political system, often overlooked, was that the indigenous Indians were not highly civilized, still lived like clans, and had not mastered basic production and farming techniques. This situation made it impossible for civilized Europeans to enslave them, because they could not provide more products. The only option for European settlers was to ask the Indians for the land under their feet. What would have been the situations if the Indians had been a fairly civilized people? This is the famous argument put forward by my mentor in graduate school, Professor Chen Chi-ren. The difference between colonies of immigrant settlement and colonies of enslaved natives. The immigrant settlement refers to the immigration of a part of the population of the sovereign state to a piece of land for labor, such as the United States, New Zealand, Australia, etc. Indigenous enslavement refers to the domination of the local people of a colony by a small group of rulers from the sovereign state, such as many countries in Africa, India, Indochina, etc. These two different types of colonies formed completely different political systems. The history of the 20th century points to this. The enslavement of the natives had a premise. Could the natives be enslaved? Asian societies had developed to a considerable level before the arrival of the colonists, providing the conditions for the enslavement of the European colonists. The Americans did not have such favorable conditions in the New World. The Indians had long been considered savages, and civilized people only enslaved civilized people, and were less willing to enslave what they considered beasts. The spirit of the Mayflower survived, not because anyone intended to maintain it, but because social life had to be regulated by it. I also saw the Plymouth Plantation, where a 17th century settlement had been preserved, and where the earliest settlers are said to have lived. This village is adjacent to the sea and looks out over miles of blue water. The village's boarded-up houses and various utensils are typical of the old-time countryside. It can be described with 4 words: poor and backward. This is natural. European immigrants came from far away with nothing and started with nothing but this environment. Villages like this are still as numerous in the world nowadays. What do they mean? Precisely because immigrants developed from a base of poverty, they especially value their wealth and their way of life. People who were born rich did not have the same strong emotions as they did, so when Britain tried to exploit them, they rose up to defend their lives, and in 1775 the Americans fought a war with the British Army, firing the first shots of the War of Independence. I visited the place where the Americans fired the first shot, and there is a monument. There is also a monument across the river by the road where the British soldier who was killed by that shot lay. The result of the war was an American victory. The American War of Independence was inspired by the spirit of the bourgeois revolutions in Europe at the same time, especially the fact that Britain itself as the ruler had a revolution. It is evident from the Constitution of the United States that its basic principles were the creations of English and French thinkers during the bourgeois revolutions in Europe. The United States did not encounter strong resistance from the old system in creating the new one, unlike the English bourgeois revolution and the French bourgeois revolution, which made it easier to declare the implementation of ideological principles that reflected the demands of the bourgeoisie. Consider why Germany could not complete the bourgeois revolution in the mid-19th century. The Junker aristocracy was too powerful. The United States focuses on preserving and protecting these physical textbooks. They are managed by dedicated staff and provide the amenities needed for public access, such as parking, kiosks, restaurants, and various types of instructions. The facilities for the exhibitions are also of a high standard, with screening rooms in almost every location where visitors can see specifically filmed films and slides. Things that are not considered cultural relics by the Chinese are carefully protected. So in the future, Americans will have a history because it is now being preserved to the fullest extent. They know they have no history, and they treasure anything that has a little historical value. In a country that is too rich in history, things of much greater value than that are cast aside. Americans not only preserve history, but know how to make these objects work as textbooks. These sites are open to the public and provide the best help for the public to fully understand them. In fact, this is spreading the American spirit, which is a socialized ideological and political education. Any society that wants to have long-lasting peace and stability should spread its value system, but the method of spreading varies, and the effect of spreading depends to a large extent on the method. Part 3. Political Creed. One of the major reasons why Europeans look down on Americans is that Europeans believe that Americans do not have a long cultural tradition and are uncivilized, like a group of hicks who have suddenly become rich. In the political sphere, this view is reflected in the European belief that Americans do not have a rich heritage of political culture. Europe has contributed such great minds as Aristotle, Plato, Hobbes, Montesquieu, Locke, Rousseau, Mill, and Hegel. A very important aspect of their achievement is that they have given wonderful discourses on the political life of human beings. Many of the basic tenets of today's European and Western politics originated from these thinkers. American political thought is less developed. The United States is only 200 years old. The American patriarchs chose a system of thought that already existed in Europe, and they did not make many new contributions. American political scholars are also outspoken. That said, one must not assert that Americans do not have a political creed and that political creeds do not work in America. Samuel P. Huntington, a political scientist at Harvard University, wrote a book, American Politics, The Promise of Disharmony, 1981, devoted to this issue. He says it would be a mistake to think that political thought plays a lesser role in the United States than it does in Europe. According to Huntington, the American creed began to take shape from the time of the War of Independence, and certain fundamental political values were developed in the United States from the late 18th to the early 19th century, which is the American creed. The core of the American creed comes from the thinkers of the European bourgeois revolution, but it also has more distant origins going back to ancient Greece. These creeds not only existed but were accepted by the majority of society. These creeds have changed in one way or another over the course of 2 centuries, but their core remains the same. These tenets form part of the self of the American nation. Not many people in society spend their days promoting these creeds, but people practice them. The universities, the courts, the government, the mass media are spreading them. To some extent, these tenets dominate society. A major topic of discussion in the Dukakis and Bush campaigns was what constitutes the American mainstream and who has left the American mainstream. Neither side was willing to leave the American mainstream without losing votes. What is the American creed? According to Huntington, it can be summarized as 1. Freedom, 2. Equality, 3. Individualism, 4. Democracy, and 5. The rule of law. It seems so simple and clear. Here lies the human dilemma. Even a simple idea is difficult to become the dominant idea in society, and it cannot be effective without the efforts of several generations. Naturally, the American creed and American practice do not exactly match. Where did the creed come from? Arguably from the Declaration of Independence, where these creeds were used as an ideological weapon in the struggle against British colonial rule. It can also be said to come from the European intellectual tradition, where these basic ideas were played out long before the War of Independence. The early American yearning for these beliefs was driven by emotional motivation, more than rational motivation. Americans believed in these creeds, though no thinker ever did a good job of addressing the relationship between these ideas. They were always treated as an ideal. That there is a conflict between these ideals is obvious. Huntington says that majority rule may lead to the violation of minority rights, that the supremacy of law may weaken the sovereignty of the people, that individualism may undermine democracy, and so on and so forth. These conflicts not only exist logically, but are also evident in the process of actual political development. Some of the dilemmas of political life can find partial explanation in this situation. Americans claim to be democratic, yet what else can ordinary people do but vote? Perhaps no society can be organized beyond this pattern. Most people share these ideas. There are various reasons for this, a major one being that prior to the War of Independence there were no hierarchical differences as in Europe, nor were there different systems of thought based on these differences. People accepted the value system created for the New World in general from the beginning. Naturally, in the subsequent flux, different social classes interpreted these tenets in different ways. The battle between the two parties is a concentrated reflection of this. Today, I am afraid I cannot say that everyone accepts these tenets, but most people accept them. Many immigrant groups, because of the influence of different cultures, have difficulty in truly sharing these creeds. For example, the Chinese Immigrant Society, the Latin American Immigrant Society, the Japanese Immigrant Society, etc. The mainstream still exists. Americans constantly protect themselves with these creeds that have no definite meaning because they have no definite content, but rather tend to survive for a long time. 140 years ago, the French historian Alexis de Tocqueville said that Americans generally believed that the people were the source of power. People respect freedom and equality. The majority of citizens have political power, and so on. These are the constituent elements of the American creed. James Bryce boiled it down to the beliefs that 1. The individual has divine power. 2. The source of power is in the people. 3. All government is limited by law and the people. 4. Local government takes precedence over the federal government. 5. The majority is wiser than the minority. And 6. The smallest government is the best government. All of which are open to interpretation. In general, Americans do not feel the need to explain to anyone who thinks they know the true transmission. However, in times of crisis, people interpret these tenets differently. Huntington argues that this happened during 4 periods: the Revolutionary period, the Jeffersonian period, the Civil War, and the turbulent 60s. What happened during these periods? Primarily, there was widespread discontent. Political ideas playing an important role in the polemics, political unrest, strong opposition to the regime, intensified psychology of change, and expanded political participation. The more important reason is that the actual politics did not fulfill these tenets. The potential conflicts accumulated and finally erupted like a volcano, thus finding new structures. Because most people believe in these tenets, the first thing people think of when they erupt is to better embody them, not to change them. Societies that keep realizing the same creed, as opposed to societies that keep changing their creed, have a continuity of social development whose efficacy for their social development cannot be ignored. Many political scientists acknowledge the existence of the IVI gap, the gap between idea and institutions in the United States. Although these beliefs are the mainstream of society, actual political life lags far behind them. Freedom, equality, individualism, democracy, and the rule of law are also things that are developing in the United States, but not to the same extent as in some societies. The question is not when these beliefs will be fully realized, but when society will create the conditions to make them a reality. Many people may not like these tenets, but the mainstream of society does not allow them to go against the tide. For the most part, people accept the trends, and only when necessary do they display the creed. The state of the political creed sheds a light on the situation. It is not easy for a society to accept a creed, and it is even less easy to actually practice them once they are accepted. For a society to develop, the first step is for the core values to become mainstream in society, and then for them to become a reality. When core values are not mainstream, it is naturally more difficult to make them a reality. A society can say what it believes in, but that does not mean that it actually has something or does not have something. Part 4. Equality or freedom. There are always core values in the values of a society, and the core values dominate the development of the whole society, dominate the spiritual activities of most of the people in the society, and are the standards by which most of the people in the society judge all kinds of private and public things. What are the dominant values in the political and social culture of the United States? There are many different opinions about this. In recent years, there have been heated debates. For example, liberals argue that the fundamental value is equality, and that the Constitution states that everyone is born equal. Neoconservatives, on the other hand, emphasize that the core value is liberty, not equality, and that liberty is the dominant concept in any era. When I was visiting Ohio University, I asked a senior professor of American politics, what exactly is the difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party? After a moment's contemplation, he replied, there are different views of freedom and equality, with the Republican Party focusing on freedom and the Democratic Party focusing on equality. It is clear that there is not a unanimous view of these two fundamental aspects of traditional Western political culture. My personal opinion is that in America today, more people tend to have freedom as their dominant value than those who choose equality as their dominant value. And the concept of freedom is the mainstream of the American spirit and culture today. Naturally, different people tend toward this concept, have different understandings and choices, and have to use it to defend their different interests. When viewed from this perspective, freedom is a concept that is more easily applied at will by people with different interests, and equality appears to be of lesser magnitude. I will analyze this issue below. Nearly 150 years ago, after a tour of the United States, Alexis de Tocqueville wrote a book called Democracy in America, which became a classic and remains one of the essential readings in the study of American politics, very difficult in a society like the United States, which lacks a sense of theoretical authority. One of Tocqueville's key arguments is that the most important fact is the full equality of conditions, an idea that plays an inestimable role in the whole process of society, and that all other values in society derive from this basic fact. This argument can be said to be right or wrong. In the case of the time after the War of Independence, the Constitution officially recognized the principle that all men are created equal. The United States did not have a tradition of feudal aristocracy, so it was easier to establish an environment of equality after colonial rule was overthrown. There was no wealth accumulated over time, no political eminence, and equality of conditions was easier to develop. It is not so easy in societies with a long history of feudalism such as England and France. Although the law may provide for equality for all, de facto inequality cannot be destroyed by force. It may be possible to destroy the material inequality, but not the spiritual and cultural inequality. This is something that America has in its favor. Tocqueville came from a continent with a strong feudal tradition, and it was natural that he felt better conditions here. If he had gone from America to post-revolutionary France, I am afraid it would have been difficult to reach this conclusion. It is wrong to say that it is wrong because the equality that people favored at the time was in many cases only a principle, and far from being a reality. Even today's American society can hardly be said to have achieved the equality of all people, as the Constitution says. Aren't many scholars and politicians fiercely attacking the inequality of this society? At the time, Tocqueville traveled around the United States. Slavery was still widespread in the South. The Civil War had not yet broken out. Women did not have equal social and political rights, not to mention the Indians, and economic inequality has always existed from then to now. If we only talk about equality of conditions and not equality of results, it seems that we cannot conclude that there was a general equality of conditions at that time. The reason for Tocqueville's impression is, I think, mainly the feeling of a man who grew up in a more unequal environment. This is not to say that there was no difference between the two societies. It should be said that the move toward equality was a historical progress. It can also be said that the people were seeking the principle of equality in those times because equality was not fully achieved. At the same time, those who choose the principle of freedom must first pursue the principle of equality, for without the prerequisite of equality, freedom can hardly be fully realized. Liberty and equality can be said to be the two main core values in Europe as well as in the West since Locke. But they do not go hand in hand. At the stage when both values are absent, or at the initial stage of their development, the contradiction between them will not be revealed or will not be sufficiently revealed. But after the two values reach a certain stage of development, this conflict will show itself. If one speaks of human freedom, of full human freedom, then equality may become a limitation because equality requires that different people have the same conditions. If one speaks of equality of results, this limitation becomes more obvious. If one speaks of equality, that means equal freedom for everyone, as Comte says. No one can enjoy more freedom. It is difficult to reach this situation in a society. There are different rules about these concepts, another place where disagreements arise. So at a certain stage of the development of equality and freedom, new contradictions arise. In Tocqueville's time, Americans did seek equality, but this equality was a very abstract and principled concept, and in reality, equality was slow to be introduced. Women's right to vote was not slowly established until the second half of the 19th century, and universal suffrage was not established until the 1920s. Equal rights for blacks did not become a consideration until the 1960s. Equal rights for Indians were consistently violated. President Lincoln rose to the call for the emancipation of black slaves, but his basic spirit was not to give blacks equal status with whites. He pledged, "I never said anything about putting Negroes in government offices. I never said that Negroes were to be united with whites in marriage. I only said that there was a tension between blacks and whites. It's not conducive to the two peoples living together." So the contemporary neoconservative notion is that Lincoln only gave freedom to blacks, not equality. In fact, in the hearts of Americans, most of them are inclined to freedom. Speaking of equality is only when freedom is restricted. Once that constraint is removed, the value or expectation of freedom is often greater than equality. Why is this so? Because the equality guaranteed by the Western system is only formal political equality, not social or economic equality. This has been recognized by Western scholars. After formal political equality is established, further demands for equality involve the interests of many people. History has determined that it is easy to provide for formal political equality, but difficult to achieve economic equality. Political equality means equal implementation of laws, equal voting rights, and many other political rights, etc. Once this premise was established, people began their own social, economic, and cultural activities. The United States was founded more than 200 years ago, and during this relatively short period of flux, the economy developed to a high degree, and accordingly, the division of interests in society was inevitably pronounced, with an increasing disparity between the rich and the poor. To this day, the rich-poor divide constitutes the main interest structure of society. In affluent societies, there are few truly poor people and few truly rich people, but the majority of the middle class considers itself to be rich or would be rich. This part of the population believes that past wealth or possible future wealth depends on free activity in the economic sphere, and to restrict this freedom and create equality would be detrimental to their interests. The economic sphere is not part of the political sphere, and equality cannot be imposed. People should enjoy full freedom in this sphere. One cannot take someone else's money and give it to another person to spend because of the emphasis on equality. Those who have money or some of it think this way. In essence, this argument reflects the desire of the rich to not limit the freedom of capital and to share a deeper level of equality with society at large. 150 years later, or at least that number of years, the situation in the United States is very different from that of Tocqueville's time. The issue of political equality has been greatly improved, though not resolved, and by the post-war black civil rights movement and the women's rights movement. The issue of economic equality has never been substantially advanced. The United States once engaged in poverty eradication, welfare policies, and progressive taxation to promote equality, but later ended up with a lot of public discontent. The Keynesian welfare policy resulted in stagflation. Since then, Keynesianism has fallen flat on its face. Large-scale social welfare programs are repugnant. The Democratic Party's repeated electoral defeats also tell a story. Welfare policies must extract higher taxes to support the government budget. High taxes don't make people happy anywhere. Americans aspire to equality, but now that equality is associated with high taxes, they are turned off. If there are still strong advances of such equality, most people will shift to an emphasis on freedom, seeing such equality as an infringement of liberty. There are profound socioeconomic reasons why freedom has become mainstream, and in fact, it reflects a polarization of conflicting interests between different groups in society. In fact, from a historical perspective, Americans see freedom more than equality, and sometimes the pursuit of freedom manifests itself in the form of the pursuit of equality. After the end is achieved, what is preserved is often freedom. It cannot be said that some people do not aspire to equality, but they can only aspire to political equality, and it would be difficult to accept it if they went further. The War of Independence pushed equality to a new level, and subsequent developments have continued to advance political equality, but equality in the economic and social spheres has been slow to advance because it is considered to be in the realm of liberty, and freedom is inviolable, especially the right to freedom of private property. Americans accept only equality of conditions, not equality of results. Once equality of conditions is established, then comes the realm of liberty. Many Americans affirm that conditional equality has been achieved, and that any further talk of equality can only be about equality of results, which is an important reason why freedom has become the dominant value today. In today's world of individualism, equality can hardly be the dominant value. Part 5. 200 Years of the Constitution. There is a historical connection between the cities of Philadelphia and Washington. Philadelphia was an important site during the American Revolutionary War, and in 1787 a convention was held in Philadelphia to write the Constitution. This Constitution has survived to this day and can be called the oldest written Constitution in the world. In 1988, the bicentennial of the Constitution was celebrated under the Statue of Liberty, and Reagan was there to speak. Americans are most proud of their Constitution. When I was in Philadelphia, I visited the building where the Constitution was written, but I only looked outside because it was so crowded. When I was in Annapolis, I saw a handwritten copy of the U.S. Constitution, a few sheets of yellow paper, but how could it play such a big role? The foundation is definitely beyond these yellow papers. The Constitution of the United States is a product of the War of Independence. The arresting evolution was about 20 years in the making, 1770 to 1790, when the United States had 13 separate colonies under the British government. 1774, the First Continental Congress was held, and 55 delegates from the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia to discuss issues of common concern. 1775, the war between the colonies and Britain, the fierce battle in what is now Massachusetts, took place. In 1776, the American political thinker Thomas Paine published his book, Common Sense, calling for independence. 1782, nearing the end of the War of Independence, peace talks were held in Paris, and an agreement was signed. 1787, the Constitution was drafted. 1788, a sufficient number of states ratified the draft Constitution, and it took effect. 1789, George Washington was elected President of the United States. In 1791, the Declaration of the Rights of Man was added to the Constitution. This was the main milestone in the political development of the time. It is clear from this that the American Constitution was born out of this struggle for independence, and its basic provisions were certainly designed to safeguard certain interests. This was the intent of the framers of the Constitution. At that time, 13 states sent 55 delegates to Philadelphia. Drafting the Constitution was a difficult task, but they did it in one summer. Perhaps it was because political, social, and cultural relations were not as developed as they have been since. If it were done today, I am afraid that it would not have been possible to create a constitution without 2 years. Washington, Hamilton, Madison, and Franklin were all involved in this work. These men were deeply influenced by European Enlightenment thinkers, and they were familiar with Locke's Treatise on Government, Harrington's Oceana, and Montesquieu's On the Spirit of the Laws. At the same time, they also had a great deal of practical experience. 20 of them are said to have participated in the drafting of state constitutions and to be well versed in the subject. 30 of them have been involved in the legislatures of the states. They were familiar with the advantages and disadvantages of officialdom, and they also laid the foundation for the Constitution. One historical condition that is worth noting when formulating the Constitution is that it is a continuation of the same system, but with a different form of organization. At the time of the American War of Independence, England had completed the Glorious Revolution for 100 years, and the British rulers were no longer the traditional feudal aristocracy. Therefore, for the United States, it was basically a new system modeled after the British political principles. In other words, the ruled wanted to live as the rulers did, and the problem facing revolutions in many countries was to change the political principles, which was much more difficult because no one knew the practice of the new principles. There was a void, such as the English bourgeois revolution, the French bourgeois revolution, the Russian revolution, and the Chinese revolution. Of course, in countries like England, France, Russia, and China, the influence of the old system was so strong that it also created difficulties in establishing a new system. Out of their own experience, the primary concerns of Americans in framing the Constitution were the authority of government and the freedom of the individual. The separation of the colonies by the British also created the conditions for the formation of a political system. This separation made it impossible for one state to dominate another. Political matters had to be negotiated, and those who made the Constitution had the backing of the states and had a great deal of bargaining power. None of the states wanted one state to have power over them. Thus, care would be taken to create a mechanism in the Constitution to guard against one state gaining such power. Kenneth Pruitt and Sidney Verba, in their book An Introduction to American Government, point out that the Constitution reflects a philosophical view. They cite a quote from John Adams. Human desires, passions, prejudices, and self-love are never conquered by love and knowledge, and you say that the love of freedom is rooted in the soul of man. Then it is also in the soul of a wolf. I doubt that one man is more rational, more tolerant, more sociable than another. Therefore, we should not rely solely on the love of freedom in the souls of men. Some political systems must be prepared to help the love of freedom to rebel against its enemies. Plevet and Wolbach's interpretation is that without political limits, people cannot be trusted. Thus, the Constitution reflects a pessimistic, not an optimistic, view of human nature. This is a major difference between Western culture and Eastern culture. Perhaps this can explain the difference in political development between East and West in some way. With these ideas in mind, the Constitution establishes the following three basic principles: the introduction of representative government, including the abolition of noble titles and the devolution of official positions with regular elections and representative politics; decentralized governance. Decentralization includes both vertical and horizontal aspects, with vertical referring to federalism, with the states retaining greater power. This was the only viable option at the time. Horizontal refers to what is commonly referred to as the separation of powers. Limited government. i.e. what the government cannot do, such as not interfering with the rights of religion, speech, writing, assembly, etc. It also establishes the principle of government of laws, not of men, and as a result of this principle, the Constitution establishes a court system. It must not be thought that those who framed the Constitution had all the toiling masses in mind and were framing the Constitution for them. What they had in mind at that time was first of all to maintain their interests, a new ruling group. The popularization of the spirit of the Constitution was a long time in coming. As late as the 1960s, black Americans were still fighting for their rights. To this day, blacks are still fighting, though not often, in blood. A question that has attracted worldwide attention is why the Constitution has survived for 200 years when other countries have no such record. Pruitt and Walbach offer one explanation. 1. The Constitution is a political document, and the political conflicts that existed in 1780 still exist today, but in different forms, such as central-local relations. 2. The constitutionally guaranteed representative, decentralized, and limited government had sufficient appeal then, and remains so today. Another important reason is the Constitution's own changes. If the Constitution had remained unchanged for 200 years, it is hard to imagine that it would have lasted until today. The changes in the Constitution are characterized by changes in content but not in form. The Constitution has changed in many ways, such as the universality of its provisions, the new interpretation of the Constitution by the Supreme Court, the rights not listed in the Constitution, and the amendments to the Constitution. The key is that the basis and procedure for constitutional change is still this Constitution and nothing else. There are no unchanging things in the world. Americans today have long interpreted the Constitution much differently than they did 200 years ago, but people would rather say that is what it was 200 years ago because it's not easy to call attention to what people say today. It's easier, sometimes much easier, to call attention to what the ancients said. The key problem is that no one actually has the power to change this Constitution, and maintaining it and interpreting it is the only way forward. Perhaps it is a general rule that if there is still some power to change the Constitution and the political system, then the society has not reached a steady state politically and socially in terms of governance. Part 6. Political Genes. There is a quiet town next to Boston, and the name of this town is Belmont. It is said that the political system of early America has been preserved relatively intact here. The town's administration is strongly self-governing and is the source of the American political system, or a reflection of the political tradition. Let's call it political genes. Professor Lucian Pye, who was the president of the American Political Science Association in 1988, also recommended this town, and we visited this special town in his company. Belmont is a small town about half an hour away from Boston by car, with a total of 26,000 inhabitants. The first person to come out and greet us was the secretary. She is the selectman. The first thing she said was that Belmont is governed by an organization of friends and neighbors who govern themselves, a kind of self-governing organization. Her second sentence was that this organization and the spirit of this organization originated in England. When the first settlers arrived on the American continent, they brought with them this tradition which has been preserved until now. In the East, especially in Massachusetts, a number of places still maintain this political character which has become a very noteworthy phenomenon in political life. A brief look at the town's organizational structure is in order. The town has a fundamental law called the General Bylaws, which in effect is the equivalent of the town's constitution. According to the town's organic law, the supreme authority is vested in the citizens, and all adult citizens who reside in the town have the right to vote. The town is organized into two parts, one for the elected officials and the other for the appointed officials. Elected officials are elected by all citizens. The head of the administration is called the electman, which is not an official title but only a proof of his status. There are 3 electors with equal powers who form the council of electors and are responsible for the day-to-day administration. The electors are re-elected every year and can be re-elected. In addition to the head of the administration being elected, there are several other administrators who are elected rather than appointed by the head of the administration, such as the Electricity Commission, the Health Commission, the Moderator, the Town Treasurer, the members of the School Committee, the Water Commission, etc. This mechanism guarantees that all of the executive departments are accountable to the voters and not dominated by the head of administration. There is also an elective town meeting similar to a deliberative body, but it is the General Assembly of all citizens that really has the power to decide. Under the elective town meeting, there is an executive secretary, an advisory board, and a town committee that helps or assists the electors in the day-to-day management of their affairs. The executive secretary and others are all appointed officials. Under the executive secretary are a number of specialized secretaries who are responsible for various matters such as community development, senior affairs, finance, fire, highway police, veteran services, etc. Under the moderator, there are the legal committee, the authorization committee, the budget committee, etc., all of which are appointed officials. This is the general state of political organization in Belmont Township. As you can see, it has the premise that the administrative officials of important departments are elected to ensure that citizens can effectively monitor and control the administrative process. Although it is a small town, the annual budget is in the tens of millions of dollars. For example, in the 1986 to 1987 fiscal year, the expenditure was $31,709,621. How such a large sum of money is spent is the biggest political issue for the town. The town's system effectively ensures the proper use of its finances and strongly precludes corruption because the finances must be open and approved by the town meeting. The town-wide meeting is generally held once a year to decide on major town matters. Let's look at the 1987 town meeting, which took place on April 27th in the high school auditorium because it was the largest venue in town. Prior to the town meeting, the matters to be voted on were issued. Matters were studied by the authorized committee and opinions were given. The 1987 meeting had 47 items to vote on. Most of them concerned how to spend money, how to expand public facilities, and how to improve living standards. There were also political ones, such as Item 2, which dealt with the delegation of authority to elected people to resolve conflicts, and Items 35 and 37, which dealt with amending the Basic Law. These items are fewer in number and are more about specific living matters such as raising the salaries of officials, expanding water pipes, providing travel expenses to officials, purchasing parking meters, building roads, and purchasing large snow plows, large trucks, photocopiers, etc. As you can see, quite a few very detailed items have to be approved by the Citizens' Assembly. Administrative officials are not allowed to spend money without permission. All finances have to be made public. At the town-wide meeting, the report of the Finance Committee and the report of the Authorized Committee are discussed. These reports list the salaries and allowances of the various officials and committee members in a clear manner. This would put an end to the practice of corruption. Under this system, it is extremely difficult to commit fraud. Naturally, this possibility cannot be ruled out. This system is very similar to the Citizens' Assembly in ancient Rome and indeed vividly reflects the basic essence of the Western political system. The town of Belmont, however, is not independent. It has a unique set of mechanisms for conducting town affairs, but it is subject to state and federal laws. One characteristic of the American political system is that its local governments are not uniform, especially at the sub-county level. Most local governments have preserved their traditional colors, and it has never occurred to Americans to unify these local governments, but rather to let them develop. This way of looking at things is also rare in the world. In terms of organizational structure, the nation is integrated, but these specific ways of functioning are different. In fact, each local government adapts to local traditions, local perceptions, and local needs. Any political system can function well only if it does so. To a large extent, the adaptation of the American political system to historical, social, cultural conditions is not reflected in federal and state governments, but in governments below the county level. This is a mechanism that is not found in a number of countries. History tends to show that the more delineated the political system is, the less adaptable the political system is. How to coordinate between macro political institutions and specific institutions is a major challenge in political development. By saying that Belmont's organization was in the genes of the political system, I mean that the later political system developed on the basis of the political rules of such small groups. The people who first came to America, having been subjected to religious and political persecution in England, had the strongest desire for political security, the deepest awareness of their rights, and the greatest wariness of political power. On the other hand, they were imbued with Western culture. They aspired in persecution to the democratic traditions of the ancient Greeks or medieval communes of the West, and they came to the New World from far away, mainly to escape one political life and establish another. This is why early Americans had a democratic outlook. Of course, similar to the democracy of the slaveholders in ancient Rome, this could only be a democracy among themselves. not among the Indians or later the blacks, but any political rights prepared for their own use had to be prepared to be shared with others or they themselves would lose them. Not only does the history of many countries prove this, but the development of modern Chinese history also shows it. By the time of the War of Independence, it was this basic spirit that the Americans wanted to consolidate. The ease with which this spirit was institutionalized in America had to do with the nature of the earliest immigrants. Imagine what America would have been like if all the British princes and nobles had come to the New World. Latin American countries and African countries have contributed a number of examples. Part 7. Political Rules. January 20th, 1989 was the inauguration day for Bush's election as the 41st president. On this day, Bush and Vice President-elect Quayle were to be sworn in on Capitol Hill. All political dignitaries, leaders of the White House, the House and Senate of Congress, and the Supreme Court are expected to attend the swearing-in ceremony. This ceremony will indicate that Bush officially becomes the president and Reagan officially leaves office. This is a major event in political life and a political rule. This rule actually serves as a constraint on the outgoing and incoming presidents, and also indicates to the nation the basic way in which the political system works. The new president has to give a speech at the inauguration ceremony, stating his basic policy ideas, which is also a sign to the nation. The transfer of political power is one of the most difficult things to solve in human political life. Many societies have not developed a sound procedure on this issue, which has become a cause of political instability. The important thing about the oath of office of the president is not that the new president has power, but that the old president thus loses power and is relieved of his duties and becomes a man of the cloth. The Constitution does not specify how the transition between the old and new presidents should take place, but the oath of office ceremony has such a long history that it has now become a fixed political rule, and the whole process is very programmed. On the morning of January 20th, the swearing-in area was prepared in front of the Capitol. VIPs and dignitaries entered the venue one after another. The venue was open to the public with a raised platform as a podium for the oath of office. At about the same time, Reagan and the dignitaries left the White House in their cars and went to the Capitol. Before the oath of office began, all parties entered the podium according to a ritual. Behind the podium was a door connected to the Capitol, decorated with a large red curtain and a red carpet, leading to the front of the podium where there was a microphone and a podium. First, the judges of the Supreme Court enter and are introduced to the podium by an usher. Then the women entered, including the respective wives of Reagan, Bush, and Quayle, and were ushered out through another corridor. Then Reagan entered. Reagan was followed by Quayle. Finally, Bush was seated. Each person or group was guided by a special person 1 to 2 minutes apart. The oath of office was administered by the chairman of the joint session of both houses of Congress. A chaplain was first asked to say a prayer for God's blessing on America, on President Bush and his family, and on Quayle and his family. Then a children's choir sang hymns of praise to God. Then a black singer sang praise songs. Quayle began with the Pledge of Allegiance, which was led by Supreme Court Justice O'Connor, who read one sentence, and Quayle repeated it. Mrs. Quayle held the family Bible, and Quayle placed his left hand on top of this Bible. After Quayle was sworn in, Bush was sworn in. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, William H. Rehnquist, led the reading. Mrs. Bush held 2 Bibles, one for family use and one used by the first president, George Washington. When he took the oath of office, Bush placed his hand on it and followed the justice's reading. After the Pledge of Allegiance, the black singer sang the national anthem, and the entire audience sang it. After the anthem, Bush gave a speech announcing his basic national policy, praised Reagan, saying, "This man has earned an important place in our hearts and in our history. President Reagan, in the name of our nation, I thank you for all the outstanding things you have done for America." Praying to God, saying, "Strengthen us for your cause, and we are willing to obey your will and write the following in our hearts. Use power to help the people, for we have been given power, not to pursue our own goals, and there is only one right use of power, and that is to serve the people." Called for a revitalization of the American spirit, saying, We can't just hope to leave our children and grandchildren bigger cars and bigger bank accounts. We should want to give them a sense of what it means to be a loyal friend, what it means to be a loving parent, what it means to be a good citizen. America is not really America unless it has noble moral goals. We have that goal today, and that is to make the nation look more lovable and the world look better. Calling for a fight against drug addiction, he said that crimes such as drug addiction should be eliminated. Asking Congress to cooperate, he said, "We need new action. We need compromise. We need harmony. And I extend my hand to you." Expressing his determination, he said, "I don't doubt the future, and I don't fear what lies ahead. Our problems are great, but our will is greater. Our challenges are great, but our will is greater. If there is no end to our imperfections, God's love is indeed vast and boundless." After Bush finished his speech, he said goodbye to the Reagans. The Reagans were then to leave Washington, D.C., which meant leaving the White House. A helicopter will take the Reagans directly to Andrews Air Force Base, where they will be flown directly to their home in Los Angeles. The Bushes and the Quayles see the Reagans to their plane. The Reagan era is over. Bush then returned to the Capitol, where in an office he signed his first documents as president, including appointments to his cabinet. After attending a luncheon in Congress, the return to the White House, sometimes on foot, was about 1.6 miles and marked the beginning of the Bush era. The process, which is highly programmed, is incredibly expensive. The approximate statistic is that the entire inauguration, almost a week, costs $30 million, including state expenses and private expenses. Tickets for the full event, including the various banquets, ceremonies, etc., were $25,000 apiece. In 1981, Reagan spent $16 million on the inauguration. All of this money was privately donated. The government also spent a lot of money, with Congress budgeting $775,000 for the inauguration. The city of Washington allocated $2.3 million to provide police, fire protection, medical care, and other services. The Department of Defense spent approximately $2.5 million to provide troops, honor guards, and more. The cost of the entire event was staggering, which is a hallmark of the American system. Most of the spending came from civilian sources, and while this suggests that there was no political obligation, it is difficult to say whether this was the case. However, as an established procedure for the transfer of power, the cost is not much compared to the chaos and even bloodshed of the transfer of power. The entire event was highly public, with extensive television and newspaper coverage of the entire event. The inauguration ceremony was broadcasted live on TV and radio. To a certain extent, the political openness also ensured that the change of power was carried out properly. This process, in fact, also tells the people that the change of power is done according to the procedure. One of the most fundamental problems of any political system is how to carry out the alternation of power. Without solving this problem, it is difficult for society to have a sustainable and stable political order. The United States has formed a set of political rules during its long history of development. Everyone must abide by this set of political rules. Contrary to this set of political rules, it is impossible to be recognized. It is impossible to have legitimacy. It is unthinkable that any outgoing president would not leave the White House. The day Bush was sworn in, Reagan moved out of the White House. The Oval Office was empty. The New York Times ran a photo of Reagan casting his last glance at the empty office. After the swearing-in ceremony, Bush will be in office here. Reagan's team will also have to move out of the White House. When Reagan left the self-presidential palace for the ceremony, the moving truck drove into the White House. After the swearing-in, Reagan flew straight to Los Angeles and became a man of the cloth. Although the outgoing president has played a far greater role in American politics than the common man, his time is over, after all. In this process, one can see how political rules and political traditions work. The ceremony is ancient. The oath of office is the same oath of office used by the first president 200 years ago, and the Bible is the same Bible used by George Washington 200 years ago. The American nation is a nation that places great value on tradition. This situation seems a bit strange. How can Americans, who are so innovative and individualistic, value tradition in such a way? In fact, the more tradition has authority where no one has the say, the greater the authority. Tradition becomes the only thing modern people can rely on, and modern people cannot come up with one thing to convince the masses. In national or state or local political life, rules and traditions are forces to be reckoned with. In the sensitive issue of power change, rules and traditions are better at binding people. In societies where modern politics is in flux and where political rules and traditions have not been developed, there is some difficulty in changing power or in finding a suitable path. In depth. Political rules and traditions are useful because they protect the power relations between different groups within the ruling class. The function of socially formed political rules and traditions is that they are appropriate for coordinating power relations between different groups in society. Such relations are rooted in the complex political, economic, and cultural mechanisms of society. Political rules and traditions are the result of the long-term functioning of a social system and best reflect the fundamental characteristics of that society. Sometimes political rules and political traditions are more powerful than laws because one is written in words and the other is written in people's beliefs. The path to a society's political development lies in turning political principles and beliefs into political rules and political traditions. Part 8. Third Republic. The Third Republic of the United States of America is an unfamiliar concept to many people. I am afraid that many people have heard of the Fourth Republic of France and the Fifth Republic of France, but not of the Third Republic of the United States of America. The concept was first introduced in 1969. Of course, this concept was introduced by a scholar in a book. His name is Theodore J. Lowy. The book was called The End of Liberalism, the Second American Republic. In this book, Lowy analyzes the evolution of mainstream thinking in the United States and points out the trend of social development. These analyses are still valuable for understanding America. In the War of Words campaign of 1988, the Republican presidential candidate chose the key strategy of accusing the Democratic candidate of being a liberal. The implication was that liberalism had become a pejorative term. Noted political scientist Samuel Martin Lipset has an article in the October 27th issue of the New York Times that looks at this shift. He says that Americans have always sought and longed for liberalism and that the War of Independence was sparked by the quest for freedom and equality back then. The tradition of Western political philosophy also has freedom and equality at its core. Now, with the change of time, liberalism has become the opposite, and it seems disgraceful to be called a liberal. This turn of events took place mainly after World War II, and especially in the 1960s. Since the 1960s, support for liberalism has been declining. What are the reasons for this? The demise of liberalism is linked to Keynesianism. The classical tenets of capitalism are the invisible hand and laissez-faire. This is the basic rule of capitalism as proposed by Adam Smith. However, the contradictions inherent in the capitalist mode of production or the regulatory requirements arising from socialized mass production form the basis of some of the ills of the social structure of capitalist society. The evolution of these contradictions, which had intensified by the beginning of the 20th century, seriously threatened Western society and the capitalist system. At this time, many Western scholars realized that the traditional Western concepts should be revised to find a way out of the dilemma. As a result, the doctrine of the British economist Keynes spread, forming what later became known as Keynesianism. The core idea of Keynesianism is very different from the traditional liberalism. He emphasizes government regulation, emphasizes the government through the visible hand to promote full employment, regulate the propensity to consume, and invest, and engage in public works. When the capitalist world encountered a general crisis in the 1920s and 1930s, Keynesianism became mainstream. If capitalism had not encountered such a huge crisis, Keynesianism would not have been able to take hold in the West. It is always human nature. One does not turn back until one hits the wall. The same is often true when it comes to government policy. It will soon be seen how Keynesianism itself has followed this path. This timing coincided with the Roosevelt administration. As a result of this principle, Keynesianism was then combined with liberalism. If the Republican Party, which advocated conservatism, had been in power, I am afraid it would have chosen Keynesianism. The times make the man. Another factor that contributed to the combination of liberalism and Keynesianism was the philosophical beliefs of liberalism. The philosophical belief of liberalism is that people are rational and can control and regulate themselves, as long as the necessary conditions are created for them to do do so. Conservatism's belief is that people are irrational and that norms should be made for their behavior. By definition, conservatism prefers government control, yet the desire to create good conditions and the reality of winning elections drove liberalism to combine with Keynes, to create good conditions through government activity. One result of Roosevelt's New Deal was a dramatic expansion of government authority, extensive government intervention in the economy, full involvement in the socioeconomic sphere, and an immediate expansion of government functions. This was a major departure from traditional capitalist beliefs. Rowe argues that this change has led to two results. One is statism, and the other is pluralism. Statism asserts the primacy of state action, and pluralism is more precisely interest group pluralism, IGP. Rowe sees interest group pluralism as the new philosophy of capitalism, a mishmash of statism, capitalism, and pluralism, or interest group liberalism. The implications of pluralism are: 1. Once interest groups come to rule the market, imperfect competition becomes the rule of social relations. 2. Imperfect competition is not really competition, but some kind of bargaining. 3. Bargaining is the only alternative to violence and coercion in industrial societies. And 4. If the system is stable and peaceful, pluralism can achieve the property of self-regulation. Interest group liberalism combines pluralism to some extent. Interest group liberalism, according to Lowe, is the Second Republic of the United States of America. He says that every Congress and every administration since 1961 has practiced this doctrine. Interest group liberalism has led to serious consequences. Government institutions have been freed from the control of the people. New privileges have been maintained and established, etc. More importantly, this new form of liberalism did not cope with the basic contradictions of capitalist society in the long term. Rowe's explanation is that liberal government cannot plan. Planning requires authoritative application of authority. Planning requires law, choice. Libertarianism replaces planning with bargaining. Liberalism can expand government functions, but it cannot coordinate those functions. Keynesian policies also had serious consequences, and deficit finance became an intractable problem for the government. These problems gradually erupted by the end of the 1960s with economic crises, fiscal deficits, social problems, economic depletion, and moral decay. The result of the combination of liberalism and Keynesianism was not glorious but dim and bleak. The general chaos of the late 60s can be a good example of why liberalism is notorious today, and why Bush can throw liberalism as a pot of dirty water on Dukakis. The First Republic, as Rowe called it, was the United States from 1787 to the 1930s, and was characterized by a federal structure with limited central government power and greater state government power. The Second Republic began in the 1930s when the powers of the central government were greatly expanded, with the primary powers being those of regulation and redistribution. The regulatory and redistributive powers made possible high wages, high benefits, high consumption, high deficits, and eventually led to social discontent. The anti-liberal sentiment is quite strong today. The Third Republic means how to get out of the rut that reached its peak in the 1960s and choose a new path. Interest group pluralism had corrupted the traditional concept of democracy, rendering the government impotent and unpredictable, and making it impossible for the government to function democratically anymore. The Third Republic, as Rowe called it, was called judicial democracy, which emphasized a sound judicial process in all areas. In the wake of the Keynesian wave, society is indeed facing new choices. How can the social framework and governance mechanisms formed under Keynesianism be changed is a major challenge. How can the expansion of government functions be reduced? Just as it is not easy for a person to lose weight once he has gained weight, one is that the government wants to be thin, the second is that the people want to be thin. Liberalism has given a lot of welfare, which many Americans hate, and is a big burden for the government. The problem is that you can't get rid of this burden, which is an important cornerstone of political stability. After the United States has suffered enough from big government, it wants to have a small government, but for American society, a small government will certainly cause a lack of blood supply for the whole society. The development of society demanded total coordination, and science and technology provided the necessary conditions, but Americans could not accept total coordination ideologically and emotionally. The memory of liberalism still grips the mind. This challenge will continue for many more years. End of Chapter 2.